History has a way of polishing its monsters. We hear about their victories, their empires, their armies marching like storms across the world. We're told of the cities they built, the kingdoms they destroyed, and the legacies they shaped. But behind every throne, behind every crown, behind every triumph carved into stone, there were doors no one was meant to open. Because the truth is this: power doesn't just conquer nations, it conquers restraint. And once a man has the world, he begins to search for something no battlefield can give him. Something darker, something hidden, something he can control completely. Ancient chroniclers understood this. They didn't just write about wars. They wrote about what happened after the wars, the indulgences, the obsessions, the secret pleasures rulers hid behind silk curtains and palace walls. Not gossip, not scandal, but behavior so extreme, even people from violent, ruthless eras whispered about it. Across centuries, from Rome to Asia, from empires of gold to kingdoms built on fear, there were rulers whose desires bent the world around them. Some sought pleasure as escape, others used it as a weapon, and a few used it as a stage for their madness. Tonight, we're not telling their life stories. We're opening those doors, one by one. This is a descent from the merely indulgent to the bizarre, to the deranged, to the darkest figures history ever allowed to rule. This is the countdown of the most perverted conquerors in history, ranked by what they actually did. And if number 10 seems shocking, just wait until you see who sits at number 1. Number 10, Timur Tamerlane. He conquered cities the way storms swallow valleys fast, overwhelming, unstoppable. But for Timur, the battlefield was only half the victory. The other half happened in silk chambers, where he proved not just that he conquered nations, but that he conquered their daughters. Persian chroniclers write of nights when the smoke of burning cities still hung in the air, and Timur's palaces erupted with music, wine, and celebration. To him, pleasure wasn't escape. It was continuation, the next phase of domination. Victors took loot. Timur took lineages. Women from conquered cities, nobles, daughters of defeated rulers, hostages from tribes, were brought before him not as companions, but as proof. Proof that his enemies couldn't protect anything. Not their walls, not their people, not their bloodline. There was nothing tender about it. Nothing intimate. Nothing personal. It was conquest extended into the body. A ritual of ownership performed after every great victory. But compared to the others on this list, Timur wasn't bizarre or ritualistic. He didn't mix pleasure with cruelty, or spiral into taboo fantasies. His perversion wasn't psychological, it was imperial. And yet, even at his most indulgent, there was a purpose beneath it all. A need to turn every victory into something he could taste, touch, and claim. Power made physical. If the countdown started with Timur, it's because he represents the threshold. The point where desire becomes entitlement, but not madness. Not yet. What comes next steps into the realm of the strange, and then into the realm of the horrifying. Number 9. Qin Shi Huang. Before he unified China, Qin Shi Huang was already feared. But once he ruled it, fear turned inward into an obsession that consumed his palace, his sleep, and his sanity. He did not fear enemies. He feared the one thing even conquerors cannot command: death. And in his desperation to outrun it, he reshaped desire into ritual. Ancient court records describe vast harems built not for pleasure, but for alchemy, chambers where partners were chosen not for affection, but for energy preservation, a mystical belief that certain unions could extend life. To Qin, intimacy became medicine, a treatment, a formula, something to be calculated, measured, and repeated. His alchemists promised him that the right balance of partners, timing, and ceremonial movements would strengthen his life force. So he obeyed, obsessively. Women weren't companions to him. They were ingredients. The emperor built entire wings of the palace, dedicated to these practices, guarded by silence and fear. Behind gold screens and incense smoke, ritual replaced affection, and the body became a tool in his war against mortality. But compared to the rulers who follow on this list, Qin Shi Huang wasn't sadistic. He didn't seek humiliation or cruelty. His desires weren't driven by madness or dominance. They were driven by terror. And yet, terror is still a powerful fuel. In his chambers, fear and superstition mixed into something strange, ceremonial, and deeply unsettling. What comes next, however, is not ritual. It is rage. Number 8. Ivan the Terrible. For most rulers, desire was about indulgence. For Ivan, it was about control, and that made him dangerous. Inside the Kremlin, his private chambers were known as places where affection could turn into terror with no warning. Companions were chosen quickly, dismissed harshly, and often treated as nothing more than emotional bandages for wounds Ivan never healed from. Chroniclers record a disturbing pattern. Moments of intimacy that twisted into violence the instant Ivan felt disrespected, insecure, or misunderstood. A word delivered too softly. A glance he interpreted as doubt. A pause he mistook for disloyalty. What began as pleasure could collapse into brutality in seconds. Servants and attendants spoke in whispers about nights where Ivan demanded affection one moment, then struck out the next. Not because he sought humiliation, but because he believed every interaction was a test of loyalty. If someone hesitated, he punished them. If someone trembled, he saw it as betrayal. His partners never knew which version of Ivan himself would emerge, the man craving closeness or the tyrant hunting for someone to blame. And for those forced into his private life, the greatest terror was never knowing whether they were being desired or destroyed. Ivan's darkness was explosive, emotional, and unpredictable. But what comes next isn't a burst of rage, it's a performance. Number 7. Commodus. If Ivan's darkness was chaotic, Commodus's was choreographed. He didn't lose control. He performed it. Inside the palaces of Rome, Commodus built a private world where desire and spectacle became the same thing. He saw himself not just as emperor, but as Hercules reborn, a god of strength, domination, and lust. And in that fantasy, everyone around him became props. Companions were selected not for affection, but for roles. Some were forced into humiliating parts in his staged heroic scenes. Others were ordered to praise him as a mythical figure, feeding the delusion that he was more than a man. To Commodus, intimacy wasn't a connection. It was a performance in which only he could shine. Every encounter was an audience. Every gesture was applause. Every command was theater. Chroniclers describe him mixing pleasure with gladiatorial fantasy, posing as a champion, rehearsing dramatic movements, forcing partners to reenact scenes that blurred the line between desire and spectacle. And if someone didn't play the part correctly, he humiliated them, publicly if necessary. Where Ivan erupted from insecurity, Commodus acted out of ego, a craving to be adored, worshipped, and obeyed in every chamber of his life. There was no tenderness in his desires, no fear, no hesitation, just a man so consumed by his own legend that the people in his bed became characters in his private myth. If Ivan terrified those close to him, Commodus degraded them. And what comes next is stranger still. A darkness built not on ego or rage, but on obsession. Number 6. Rudolf II. Hidden inside the vast, echoing chambers of Prague Castle, Rudolf II built a world that didn't exist anywhere else in Europe, a world where desire was stripped of humanity and rebuilt into ritual. He collected erotic art the way other rulers collected armor. Paintings, sculptures, and curiosities depicting scenes so explicit, so oddly symbolic, that later emperors locked them away out of embarrassment. These works weren't decorations. They were instructions, objects Rudolf arranged his private life around. Chroniclers whispered that he preferred his partners positioned like the figures in his paintings, posed, arranged, angled to match the fantasies frozen in oil and marble. Touch mattered far less to him than the image, the tableau, the composition. To Rudolf, desire was an experiment. He summoned alchemists, mystics, artists, and select companions to private gatherings, where live participants were made to mimic the art around them, sometimes intertwined with statues, sometimes arranged beside occult diagrams, sometimes illuminated by strange colored lights meant to activate certain emotions. There was no warmth in it, no connection, just a cold fascination with symbols and bodies as interchangeable components in his rituals. Partners were not chosen for affection, but for how well they fit the imagery in his mind. He treated them like rare artifacts, handled carefully, studied intensely, then forgotten when a new symbol captured his attention. Rudolf's perversion wasn't violent. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't even emotional. It was fetishistic obsession, a hunger for shapes, poses, arrangements, and occult symbolism that made his private world feel less like a palace and more like a laboratory of desire. And what comes next is no longer cold fascination, but the unrestrained madness of a ruler who destroyed everything he touched. Number 5. Ibrahim the Mad. When Ibrahim became sultan, the Ottoman palace didn't simply change, it warped. The court said the harem began to breathe with his moods, swelling and shrinking according to whatever craving seized him that day. Ibrahim didn't seek companionship. He sought stimulation, and he demanded it in quantities no palace could sustain. He fixated on appearances, obsessing over certain features, shapes, and types with a hunger that shifted by the hour. One day he demanded women with long black hair, the next with pale skin, the next with bodies that matched a figure he'd seen in a dream. Servants scoured the empire to satisfy these whims, often returning with dozens at a time. Once inside the palace, these women didn't enter a home. They entered a storm. Ibrahim's indulgences were frantic, exhausting, compulsive, night after night of excess that blurred pleasure into mania. He gave gifts, titles, and entire estates based on a single night's obsession, then discarded those same favorites the moment his mood darkened. And beneath all of this lay something far more dangerous: paranoia. The more Ibrahim indulged, the more he feared betrayal. Whispers of infidelity, real or imagined, struck at his deepest insecurity. The harem became a mirror he couldn't trust. Then came the rumor. No name, no evidence. Just the suggestion that a woman inside the harem had been unfaithful. That whisper ignited the most infamous act of his reign. In a panic of jealousy and fear, Ibrahim ordered the entire harem, hundreds of women, bound in sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus. It wasn't justice. It wasn't punishment. It was the final collapse of a man whose desires had spiraled beyond his own control. With Ibrahim, lust and madness were identical, a single force that dragged an empire into terror. If Ibrahim was ruled by madness, the next ruler mastered it and performed his darkest desires for an audience. Number 4. Nero. Nero liked to be watched, not because he craved affection, but because he craved reaction. It wasn't enough for him to rule Rome. He wanted Rome to witness the theater of his private desires, to feel smaller, weaker, and dependent on his approval. For Nero, intimacy was never private. It was a stage, and everyone around him was forced to perform. Chroniclers described nights where he transformed palace chambers into miniature theaters. Curtains, props, music, attendants positioned like stagehands. He assigned roles to his companions, mythical figures, defeated heroes, humiliated gods, then directed them as if he were staging grand tragedies. Those who performed well were rewarded. Those who resisted were shamed. The most notorious example was Sporus, a young servant Nero, publicly altered and presented to Rome as his bride. The ceremony had guests, musicians, and even a dowry, a grotesque mockery of Roman marriage. Nero didn't want a spouse. He wanted a symbol, proof that he could reshape a human life into whatever character his fantasies demanded. Behind closed doors, the performances grew darker. He forced noblemen's wives into roles designed specifically to humiliate their husbands, then made those same husbands watch in silence. For Nero, pleasure and punishment were inseparable. Humiliation was the script. Intimacy was the stage. Rome's elite were his actors. What unsettled chroniclers wasn't the scale of Nero's appetite. Rome had seen emperors with vast desires before, but the precision of his cruelty. Every scene he staged had symbolic meaning. A message about power, dominance, and the fragility of dignity in the presence of an emperor. To Nero, people were instruments through which he played out his visions. His desires weren't impulsive like Ibrahim's, nor chaotic like Elagabalus's. They were directed, crafted, produced, a theater of humiliation performed before unwilling audiences. And yet, even Nero's twisted spectacles feel almost restrained, compared to what Rome endured next, a ruler who turned humiliation itself into a weapon of state. Number 3. Caligula. From the earliest days of his reign, Rome sensed something was fatally wrong. Caligula didn't simply want obedience. He wanted submission, and he wanted it displayed like a trophy, where the entire court could watch powerful men swallow their pride. Inside his private chambers, this obsession rotted into something even darker. Caligula treated intimacy the way a conqueror treats defeated cities. Something to invade, exploit, and parade as proof of domination. He demanded access to the wives of senators, not out of desire, but to watch the husbands break in silent humiliation. More than once he returned from these encounters, only to critique the women in front of their husbands, laughing, mocking, describing them like livestock at auction. During imperial banquets, he turned noble women into exhibits. He ordered them to stand, inspected them openly, and announced which of them he intended to take that night. Not behind closed doors, but as a public verdict, a message carved into the pride of Rome's elite. His companions lived in unending fear. Caligula did not hide his cruelty. He broadcast it. He enjoyed proving that no law, no marriage, no lineage, and no amount of dignity could withstand his whims, unlike Nero, who crafted symbolic dramas. Caligula's darkness had no art and no disguise. It was pure ego, a lust for degradation so intense that even a society famous for indulgence whispered about his appetites. What made him terrifying wasn't the acts themselves, but the joy he took in collapsing the reputations of Rome's most powerful families. In his hands, intimacy became a weapon sharper than any sword. If Nero performed his cruelty, Caligula declared his from the rooftops. And yet, even his infamy could not prepare Rome for the emperor who followed, a youth whose desires shattered boundaries that even Caligula had never approached. Number 2. Elagabalus. If Caligula weaponized humiliation, Elagabalus dissolved the concept of limits altogether. He arrived in Rome as a teenager, beautiful, impulsive, and completely unprepared for the empire he now controlled. Guided by advisors who feared him as much as they served him, He reshaped the imperial palace into something Rome had never seen. Not a court, but a playground of fantasies. And those fantasies followed no rules, not moral rules, not social rules, not even the unspoken rules of Roman indulgence. He chose partners from every layer of society: slaves, soldiers, nobles, performers, not out of desire alone, but because their differences entertained him. Every new face was a new experiment, a new reaction to watch, a new scandal to unleash on Rome. Chroniclers describe scenes that felt less like private encounters and more like chaotic rituals. Guests were assigned roles, costumes, tasks, sometimes flattering, often humiliating, always unpredictable. A man might be elevated to honored companion one night and treated as a joke the next. And unlike the emperors before him, Elagabalus hid nothing. He paraded partners through the streets, staged ceremonies that twisted Roman tradition into spectacle, and sought out taboo pleasures with a kind of radiant curiosity. To him, desire wasn't an emotion. It was a game, a constant search for the next boundary to break. Even Roman historians, men who had witnessed centuries of decadence, wrote about him with caution. They turned to metaphors, hints, and coded language, as if setting down the truth too plainly would scandalize even future generations. Because Elagabalus didn't simply cross Rome's boundaries. He erased them. He danced in the space where shame used to live, and built a palace where no restraint, no hierarchy, and no taboo was allowed to survive. And yet, as extreme as his reign became, one emperor would eclipse even him, a ruler whose private world was so disturbing that ancient Rome recorded it only in whispers. Number 1. Tiberius. By the time Tiberius withdrew from Rome, he had ruled an empire, crushed rebellions, and outlived nearly every enemy he ever had. But none of that is how history remembers him. History remembers Capri, the emperor's retreat, a white villa perched above brilliant blue water, should have been a sanctuary for an aging ruler. Instead, it became a kingdom of shadows, the most infamous private world in Roman memory. Tiberius arrived on the island old, bitter, and convinced that Rome had betrayed him. He abandoned the capital and built a new realm from the ground up. A realm without senators, without scrutiny, without anyone who could refuse him. And inside that isolation, something in him unraveled. Chroniclers describe Capri as a place where normal rules seemed to melt the moment one stepped ashore. The villa was filled with attendants selected not for status or skill, but for youth, obedience, and vulnerability, brought to serve a ruler whose desires had drifted into something Rome did not have language for. Whispers spread of rituals, games, and acts so taboo that even writers who had openly condemned Caligula and Nero could not bring themselves to record them plainly. Those historians resorted to metaphors: shadows, corruption, the pit beneath the palace, as if writing the truth would stain the scrolls. To them, Tiberius had crossed a boundary no Roman emperor had ever crossed. He created a world where power was absolute, and the powerless existed solely to absorb the darkest impulses of a man cut off from the real world. On Capri, there were no witnesses and no escape. What Tiberius imagined, others endured. By the time he died, his island was already legend, a warning whispered through generations, a place where an emperor's desires rotted into something beyond cruelty, beyond indulgence, beyond comprehension. If every other ruler on this list pushed the limits of power, Tiberius erased them and built a kingdom where only his darkness remained. Even now, the cliffs of Capri carry his shadow. History often measures greatness by conquest, by how many cities a ruler burned, how many borders they redrew, how many armies marched under their name. But this descent has shown something different. Behind the victories, behind the monuments, behind the crowns and triumphs, there were men whose desires shaped their empires as much as their swords did. Some sought escape, some sought meaning, some sought worship, and some, like Tiberius, built worlds where no boundary could survive. Their private lives were not side stories. They were mirrors, revealing what power becomes when no one can say no. The Romans had a saying, "The soul of a man is known by how he uses his freedom." And in the silence of their chambers, these rulers showed the world who they truly were. What remains today are not the details, too distorted by time, too dark for the page, but the warning: when a man gains the whole world, he may lose the last thing that keeps him human. The doors are closed now. The islands, the halls, the palaces, quiet, but the shadows they left behind still whisper.